Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. I am back in functional condition again, and so is my good co-host GSP over here. Of course, I am Constantine Martelli. I've realized, actually, going back to listening to shows, that I don't introduce us at the beginning of the shows, which is something that everyone does, but something I realized that I don't do. Probably because our audience is such a insular system. Which, don't get me wrong, I like that. I like that a lot, and you all know who I am, but I figured it's a bit out of form for me not to, so I'm going to start trying to do that stuff. And I actually have some good maps today because I know sometimes, and by sometimes I mean a lot of times, I forget those sort of things. So we'll start with the situation in Gaza. So, no surprise, the Zionists had launched an airstrike claiming to take out one of the leaders of one of the various Palestinian resistance groups. There's about a dozen at this point that they go back and forth. I mean, half of them are controlled opposition, the other half are aligned with Iran, the other half are aligned with whoever. It's what you'd expect from a situation like this. Now, I'm not saying the entire Palestinian resistance is a controlled op movement, far from, but I think quite a bit of it is, especially in Gaza. I mean, we know for a fact that Hamas at least started out as a controlled op group. So it's not unprecedented, but that's not really related to what I'm getting at. So you have the usual strikes on Gaza. Now the air raid sirens in parts of southern Israel that border Gaza are going off right now. You have what is said to be both sides are mobilizing reserves. And this is on top of a rather unstable political situation in Israel, as we've been detailing for the last few episodes and for about the past year. So as we all know, Israel is going to an election in November, as we've talked about many times. And I believe that's going to be the fifth election in the past 6 or 7 years. So, about what you'd expect from a country, say, like Spain or Italy or one of these other small southern or eastern European nations that isn't really a stable parliamentary system. In fact, it's worse because in a lot of those countries, they can at least have a coalition formed without it going to election every year. But we're getting to the point in Israel where it seems to be going to an election every year or every other year. As you'll recall, Netanyahu was ousted as a result of the previous election. Then there was Lapid, and then there was Bennett. I completely forgot about Bennett. There was Bennett, who then stepped down, who then gave power to Lapid, who formed a caretaker coalition until the election can take place this coming November, which also coincides with the U.S. congressional elections. I mean, they might as well be one and the same just to make the obvious joke there. But with all that being said, as what happens with these sort of situations, there's always some sort of big posturing, especially on the Israeli side, from whoever's in power, that they are strong on the issue of security, particularly regarding the situation in Gaza, because there's not that much resistance that comes out of the West Bank nowadays, which in a way sort of justifies what happens in Gaza with a lot of these armed groups because of they can look just across at the alternative, just again a few dozen miles away. I mean, at some points, and I'm sure you've all seen the maps. That's a map I actually don't have of the loss of land over time and the shifting of land from the original 1947 proposal to what we have. The ones that people would post is a few years old, so it's like 2013, 2014. And I mean, it's only gotten worse, especially under Trump and especially under Netanyahu in the West Bank. And then, of course, there was the recognition of the Golan Heights annexation back in 2019 by Trump. So, all these things to bolster Israel. And as we've said pretty much since the beginning of the show, Israel is in a unfavorable situation, to say the least. And that is due to a variety of factors, which include internal factors such as political disputes, even a demographic question. There are more Arabs that are becoming Israeli citizens, so to speak. And then you also have the ongoing region wide proxy war with Iran funding groups in Syria, groups in Lebanon. In fact, the new general of the IRGC, General Salami, as I like to call him. It's spelled that way, but I'm sure there's a Persian pronunciation that I'm overlooking here. We need to get Perseus back on the show, which I don't want to say anything, but is a possibility. Of course, I'm sure you all remember. You longtime War Report fans know exactly who I'm talking about. Fun fact: GSP was not the original co-host of the show, but you know who's always been here? Yours truly. I will never. Come hell or high water, I will not abandon you. But not to sing my own praises too much with that. You had General Salami or Salamai or whatever the proper Persian pronunciation of that is, at least claiming that 100,000 rockets have been sent to Hezbollah. Now, as things are, that figure is probably inflated. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it's that's all.
Almost certain.
Yeah, politics, geopolitics. That's all it's about. You want to exaggerate your own claims while downplaying your rivals' claims. So, I mean, I would imagine with the rate of Iranian missile production, at least if I have up to date information, up to date general information, I don't have exact figures in front of me, that the total is probably around 100,000, but I doubt it's over 100,000, but it's probably a lot of missiles, which, as we've seen in previous years, especially in Syria, Hezbollah has really punched above its weight in terms, and not even to mention the 2006 war, where it completely repelled the invasion. Now, as for the missile stockpiles in Gaza, I can't speak that much to that or to the quality of that. Now, Gaza is usually known for having very cheaply, like practically homemade missiles that I've jokingly called bottle rockets, and as have many other people, and that these are the massive tech that the Israelis are afraid of. However,
Eh.
they do consistently have enough to overwhelm the Iron Dome, which means A, the Iron Dome isn't all it's cracked up to be, or B, it's a lot of missiles. Now, not to get off on too much of a tangent, but the Iron Dome, of course, it's an Israeli air defense system, as I'm sure you all know, that is based on American air defense systems. But the Israelis claim the Iron Dome has a 90% interception rate versus about the 60 or 65% interception rate, which is good, don't get me wrong, but that is a gross exaggeration. I don't think there's any air defense or missile defense system in the world at this point that has a 90% interception rate. I mean, I even trump up Syrian air defense. I talk a lot about Syrian air defense whenever I talk about Israeli strikes there. But again, I'm under no illusion that S-200s and S-300s operating out of Syria are intercepting 90% of Israeli missiles. Now, a lot of it, I would say, goes down to the quality of Israeli pilots. Israeli pilots are infamously, I won't say incompetent, but underperformed compared to, say, their peers, and certainly underperformed compared to the major powers such as the United States, Russia, most major European countries, and probably even the Chinese at that point, at least in terms of.
The Brits as well. They
Um,
usually tend to have good pilots.
oh yeah, the Brits do punch above their weight when it comes to pilots. And to start yet another tangent, I believe it was a 2015, 2014, 2015 exercise where the German Air Force in the war games actually beat their American counterparts. So Germany actually still also fields very good pilots despite having a very underprepared Air Force. So that's just an interesting fact I'll throw out there when it comes to just the quality of pilots in the respective countries. And of course, the Russians, they have very innovative pilots. Let's put it that way. I mean, they've I'm sure you've all seen the videos of some like the post-stall maneuvers that they do. I'm not talking about this. Well, actually, I am talking about this because I've been playing a lot of Ace Combat lately. But that will come later. I will discuss. I will probably discuss that at a different point. And I don't know if I can get, and if you're listening, you know who exactly I'm talking to. You know who you are. There's a listener to the show who I like to talk about a lot. With aircrafts and aviation. So we might have a special on that. I'm not going to promise anything. But to get back to Gaza, you have a situation that is continually escalating now. It's been on and off, I would say, especially since the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You've had a consistently increasing tensions. Not that it was exactly a peaceful and stable situation before, as it has never been a peaceful or stable situation since the establishment of the Zionist state. But with what we have there, it is especially tense for the modern era. I would say since the crises in the
The Intifada,
1970s. I, hell, I'd go. I mean,
the
that's a good
second
point. But
Intifada.
yeah, I would go all the way back to some of the state-on-state conflicts, like with Egypt, like going back to like '73. So, but I mean, you certainly make a good point in particular when it comes to the Palestinians and the occupation forces. Second Intifada is a good comparison point, and people are always talking about when's the third one going to be, when's the third Intifada going to be. I would argue that we're already in it. I'd argue that we've been in it since the official opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
Hmm.
Um, and we've also discussed the dire situation that Israel has been in many times on this. And again, maybe it's because I'm living through this era. Maybe people said the same thing in 68 or 73 or whenever. But I don't see a way Israel comes back on top of this. Now, I've gone as far as to say that in my lifetime, and I still do hold to this prediction, in my lifetime, there will no longer be an Israeli state at some point. Maybe in the near future, I'm not going to put a date on it, but me as a man in my early 20s, I think at some point before I die, the Israeli state will cease to exist before that happens. Maybe your lifetime too. I don't know. I'm not going to go as far as to speculate that. I know that you're very high maintenance. It's a miracle that you're still with us right now. But I jest a little at least. But I'm having fun with this one tonight. Okay, I don't care. We're back. I'm fully back in commission, and we're gonna go all out tonight. We have a lot of stories to cover, and to put aside the filibustering, finally to get back actually to it, because the Gaza thing, it is a bit hard to talk about because it's simultaneously the same thing over and over, but the details are also just as hazy whenever it happens because you have the report of however many Palestinian rockets and however many were intercepted and how many Israeli strikes were going to be, and it again they sort of all blend together. But looking at this from an overall situation, Israel, I would say objectively, has its back against the wall. The situation in Egypt, of course, Egypt is a key part of Israeli security, and the tentative peace that they've had since '79 is just that, tentative. And Egypt is it's under a military, let's be honest, a military regime currently, but who knows the future holds there. Things are relatively stable there, but especially as American power wanes and American bribes to Egypt, because let's be honest, that's what they are, is American bribes to Egypt wane, Israel may have to contend with a security situation there as well, on top of the encirclement in the north by Iranian and pro-Iranian forces. And especially with the situation in Gaza with Egypt, if they loosen up on it, because Egypt since '79 hasn't really been a so-called ally to the Palestinian cause. They've tried to keep their noses out of it more or less. But if that situation changes, if Israel does fall out of favor with the current Egyptian regime or whatever one follows it, it could be checkmate for the Zionists. And I don't say that to exaggerate. I don't say that to be hyperbolic. But their northern flank, some people may disagree, but their northern flank, and this is exactly what the Clean Break memo is about. I'm sure you can all go back and look at Richard Perle in the '90s and the American strategy in the early 2000s as a result of that, and some of the stuff coming out of the Pentagon at that time, and of course coming out of Israeli military intelligence at that time. Their primary concern was their northern flank, was that border with Syria and Lebanon, and especially the influence that Iran could press into there. The war in Syria, which was meant to create a favorable situation for Israel, and you can even go through the WikiLeaks documents, you can go through, again, the dreaded Hillary emails, and a lot of that is confirmed. A lot of the actions in Syria was to the benefit of Israeli security. You look at that, you could argue that the Iranians have a stronger presence in Syria than they did in 2011 or beforehand. Not to mention the Russian presence and the constant back and forth relationship, and especially how uncertain it is now with the relationship between Russia and Israel. Israel may have painted itself in a corner, and I say that in no uncertain terms.
Right, and there's a little bit of an interesting thing, about like honestly that I've only recently discovered. And that is like the Al Quds Brigade actually receives like it trains with Spetsnaz.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was seeing the reports about that a few days ago, and like, it was a comparison to like how the Israelis started working with Azov and other groups in Ukraine, and then somebody posted that like this is interesting. It looks like there's a developing sort of, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a proxy war yet, but the situation for a proxy war is developing between Russia and Israel.
Right. Like now, I'll say this that they're being trained because they want to fight in the war in Syria. But
I
I've
mean,
I
but
have
let's be honest. They all know that they're going to take that training elsewhere once their time in Syria is up.
right. But they have been trained in previous years. I've seen some videos where like they're training with Russians back in 2013. So you can see why, like Israel, trained Azov Battalion, and some Israeli representatives even visited Right Sector. Right. I mean, can even find videos of like uh, you know female Israelis like whatever bragging about working with the Ukrainians and so on. But so that animosity is there. There is like they're frenemies. Like they both want things, and what they want contradict each other. Um, but anyways, I I had forgotten to be perfectly honest with everybody that the Russians do train Palestinians in Syria, but the training. I mean, of course, in the Soviet era, because I grew up in that era, everyone always knew that Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians worked closely with the Soviets. So that's not a surprise. But I must say that aside from the Syrian theater, I did not know that Palestinians train with Russians even in Russia and even earlier than 2019.
Yeah, I was shocked to see how far it went back. I knew that in relation to Syria, they trained various groups, which at that point obviously would include pro-Assad Palestinian groups, but I didn't realize how actually deep this went. And it does make the situation regarding Israel and the right sector in Azov make a lot more sense in terms of a tit for tat sort of situation. I mean, I
Hmm.
figured it was, of course, just Israel doing what Israel does, but um, not that I've all of a sudden become in support of either Israel or Ukraine. Don't get me wrong, but the situation becomes much clearer when you realize that the Russians have been doing this and have been, again, as you said, their interests in the Middle East often come head to head with Israel,
Yeah.
and which made Putin and Netanyahu's relationship all the stranger because we had discussed this before, especially in regard to Syria, that they have what seems like a very friendly and cordial relationship, and maybe as maybe not even, I wouldn't even say two individuals, but as two figureheads of their respective countries, maybe they get along, but their countries' interests fundamentally clash, and both those men, love them or hate them, will actually, to the most part, put their country's interest first when it comes to that. It's not going to be something of a buddy buddy situation where their great personalities just mesh together and they find some sort of peace agreement. But that was, I would say, vital for Israel that they had somebody who could have that kind of relationship with Putin and the Russian leadership, because we've seen since Netanyahu come out, when since Netanyahu has come out of office, that whether that be Bennett or Lapid or whatever clown is set to replace either of them, that the relationship between Russia and Israel has become much more tense. Israel has much less bargaining power with the Russians, which is crucial at this time in Syria as things are starting to come to a close. We're starting to see what the results of the Syrian war are actually going to look like, especially at the negotiating table. And not to mention Russia as something of a mediator between them and the Iranians. You'll recall, actually, part of the Iran deal was the Russians trying to sort of smooth the situation over because the JCPOA, of course, included the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and a number of other countries that were helped draft and enforce the agreement. But even though the Israeli right, even though like Netanyahu and Likud may have been stark opponents of the JCPOA and other such agreements, you do have to realize that a big part of that was, especially when it came to Russian involvement in said agreements, was trying to smooth things over. And they also played an instrumental role in the third-party negotiations in Jordan in, I believe it was 2018, where you had this very comical situation of a Jordanian who would run back and forth between the Iranians and the Israelis and like bring back the counteroffers, where they were negotiating just through this third-party Jordanian in like the same hotel in Amman. So you get situations like that. And once again, I will say, when it comes to the topic of Israeli security and hell, even their existence in the region, a let's just call it a working relationship with Russia, even in the presence of an American hegemony, but especially now as Russia's influence is growing around the world, in the Middle East in particular, a working relationship with Russia is crucial, and especially in light of the Ukraine conflict, they seem to be squandering it again and again, to the point where even Netanyahu has said, "You're squandering my work."
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say about the Palestinians, is that gradually their rockets are better than they were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. That has increased. Um, they're missile maxing to impress the hose.
Simple as.
Simple as. No, but in all seriousness, they are getting more sophisticated, and I would say the next step for them is, it's not going to be easy, but attempts have already been made to get an air defense system, some kind of an air defense system, right?
They're going to bring home some S-300s.
Uh,
Maybe S-200s with their budget, but
yeah,
still.
that's right. That's right. Uh, oh my God. Yeah, I mean that would literally would be World War III if that. So, looking at the Palestinians, and when you look at how much land that they've lost over time and how little anyone cares about them, you know, um, there is also a kind of desperation on their part. Every generation must feel a little bit like, on the one hand, it's the generation that will continue the fight. On the other hand, you look at the reality on the ground, and it could be the last generation that can stand up against Israel. On the other hand, Israel itself is a state that cannot exist without immense funding. So Western hegemony is absolutely necessary for the money that it receives from the US and from Germany. There are other countries that send money and aid packages to Israel, of course. But in terms of like absolute freebies, it's America and Germany that send the most.
I will say, however, a case for Israel having a better standing than what I would personally give it credit for is that, and I'll get into some of this with the Zawahiri alleged assassination, is that American operations, part of the so-called war on terror over the past 20 years, have crippled several Muslim nations, including several principal rivals of Israel, which I would say Iraq and Syria. I mean, you might not think much of those, but they were still a major thorn in the Israeli side. Now, I know I was just talking about how the Iranians have grown in influence as a result of the subsequent wars in Iraq and Syria, and I don't deny that, but again, they've also stretched themselves pretty far, and the Iranians, while I don't think their regime is at any risk of collapse anytime soon, they do have a lot of internal problems that they do need to cope with. The Saudis and the Gulf states, even though they're solidly pro-Israel, again, much thanks to American foreign policy, are also in a similar economic crunch as the Iranians, even without the sanctions. Again, I've talked a lot about the Saudi budget over the course of the show and how they really haven't recovered since the drop in prices around 2014, 2015 with the oil boom in the U.S. and how energy prices went down for those several subsequent years. And in fact, up until pretty much Biden came in office, we were in a energy golden age, at least in my personal opinion, when it comes to the affordability, especially of gasoline and just oil in general. I mean, there was that point in 2020 where oil went into the negatives, as I'm sure you all remember. And as we discussed, Egypt is a country that is being held together by a military regime that had to come in and oust the more radical elements that came into power as a result of the Arab Spring. The Jordanians couldn't mount a resistance even if they wanted to. So Israel is relatively secure insofar as all of those things are concerned, and that the past 20 years of American action has done a number on these countries, which I would say is probably the biggest saving grace for Israel at this point. Not that these countries can't recover or anything, but they've been set back years, if not decades, especially in a country like, say, Iraq.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's all I had for the Israeli issues in particular, and I will just give you a brief Syria update before I get into some of this conspicuous Zawahiri stuff. So here's just your general map of Israel. As you can see, a lot of action concentrated in northwestern Syria around the Idlib area, and closing ever in on Idlib as we speak. So you have the pro-Assad forces once again continuing their shelling campaign, continuing their advance. You have Russian strikes against targets in the greater Idlib area. You have uh, some pushback from the opposition, however, in my opinion, too little too late. But once again, a lot of the activity in Syria comes from Turkey and their proxies fighting against the Kurds and the SDF and other affiliated groups. You have the occasional ISIS resurgence, the skirmishes and the attacks that come out of eastern Syria along the Euphrates and the Deir ez-Zor area. So those continue as well, harassing Syrian forces and pro-Syrian forces. And once again, as I said, you have Turkish forces not beginning the massive promised operation, but Turkish and Turkish-backed forces continuing their shelling campaign, their drone campaign, and you've actually had, especially in the area of northwestern Syria, I'm sure you can see like the the Manbij area, the YPG, the branch that actually still calls itself the YPG, has actually been putting up quite a bit of resistance against the Turkish-backed forces in northwest Syria. So slowly but surely, the conflict in Syria continues, and I once again reiterate, I think the only way that this conflict will be resolved any long term will be at the bargaining table, particularly between Turkey and Russia at this point, as well as, say, the involvement of other powers. Certainly the Iranians will have a large voice at the table, maybe even some of the European powers if they come around, depending on the situation with Russia. But ironically enough, and perhaps fittingly enough, the Americans and the Israelis will, in all likelihood, be shut out of the peace process in the conflict
Yeah.
that they were the main perpetrators of and hope to stand to gain the most. And actually, looking at the conflict, perhaps well, I would say certainly the opposite was what happened when it came to their plans for Syria, as we just went through with the Israeli segment, and once again also addressing the interests of the American empire in having a fractured Syria outside of its benefits to Israel. So once again, not to talk myself up too much because I know I sometimes have a habit of that. Last summer of Idlib is a striking possibility. Um, I'm giving it until again late September, whenever the autumnal equinox is this year. It's either the 21st, 22nd. That may be overshooting it a bit, but I might be pretty close. I'm not I'm not adjusting my prediction, but I will say if Idlib falls before the end of the year, I will consider myself mostly right.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And if it happens in October, it's just as well it happened in September.
Yes. Like I said, I'm still sticking to the last summer of Idlib, which if you want to get semantic, that is true. But I still think Idlib will fall more or less by the end of summer with the way
Well,
things
I
are.
mean, up in Canada, October we call Indian summer, so
Oh
technically
yes,
still.
that is correct. I have heard that before. So you also celebrate Thanksgiving in October. So
Yeah.
uh, we don't talk about that, but here we are talking about it. So I will quickly move on to some of the Zawahiri news. Now I will say,
He's dead.
yeah, we certainly got him this time. I know it's been the third or fourth time, and if my takes sound influenced at all, I will say full disclosure. It was actually the Myth of 20th Century podcast did a pretty interesting episode that covered, at least in part, some of the Zahiri stuff. So if you're hearing a lot of familiar takes or maybe even dare I say unoriginal takes, it may just be coming out. I don't intend to plagiarize or but sometimes there's only so many takes to go around. But just giving my take on the situation and yours as well, we will get to when I get past my ramblings. I'm sure you'll have plenty to add here. But Zawahiri, of course, was the successor to Osama bin Laden in terms of Al Qaeda. Now, it is a bit strange to hear about Al Qaeda, especially after the fall of Afghanistan, which happened just shy of a year ago. It happened on August 15th, 2021, was the day everything really fell after a few months withdrawal process starting in May of 2021, stretching through August of 2021. I'm sure you all remember the debacle at the Bagram airport, something that we covered to a great extent. You can go back to our episodes from last July. It was pretty much the entire show was talking about Bagram, Bagram, Bagram. And we still don't even know the full story there, just because there was so much conspicuousness that happened with Bagram and what a disaster that was. But we're a year out of Afghanistan, more or less. Uh, the, the most recent press you had out of Afghanistan was about a week after we withdrew. There was a story about how a drone strike actually had gone wrong and taken out somebody and his family that just had absolutely nothing to do with just, again, civilians. I think they were actually pretty well-to-do civilians, but civilians nonetheless. As opposed to, I think they claimed to hit some like ISIS-K leader, because ISIS-K was like the branch that popped up all of a sudden as America was withdrawing, and they've never told us what the K stands for, even though I have my personal speculations on what the K stands for, and I'll leave you all to speculate on that speculation. But with that being said, we're out of Afghanistan. It doesn't seem like it's the priority of the American regime at all to find an excuse to re-enter into the country. Of course, I mean, drone strikes and operations have more or less continued. Not to the extent that they did during the actual war, but, I mean, it's not like we ever fully get out of anywhere until the American empire collapses. So there's always been, intelligence networks on the grounds, drone strikes, airstrikes, whatever. But they struck him in Kabul, which, going back to just the history of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, they always hit out in everywhere that wasn't Kabul because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. And not to mention, I'm not going to say for certain, but I do believe it was around the time ISIS arose that the Taliban and Al Qaeda did sever ties from one another. I don't think they declared war on one another, but they haven't been tight knit allies in over 2 decades. Let's just put it that way. They haven't been tight knit allies since the 90s. And even in the 90s, calling them tight knit allies is a bit of an exaggeration. Al Qaeda operates and bases out of Afghanistan because it was an easy country to hide out in. And Al Qaeda, I will say, has not really been relevant since 2013, 2014, since ISIS came on the scene, especially in Iraq. ISIS more or less, whether through combat or through defections, cleared out Al Qaeda's ranks. There were some networks in Syria, such as Al Nusra, which later rebranded, and groups like HTS and all these splinter groups that are official affiliates of Al Qaeda
Yeah.
operating in Syria, and that's really the base of their operations nowadays. I think there's some branches in Yemen and, again, just far flung parts of the Middle East and Africa where there's groups that still pledge allegiance to Al Qaeda, but they are a shadow of their former selves. Not that they were ever really a great.
They were gonna take freedom away from Americans.
That's what George Bush told me, and who am I to disagree? But in all seriousness, going back again, it's not the organization that was able to bomb the USS Cole or, depending on what you believe, play a role in the September 11th attacks or in any of these embassy bombings. I mean, not that they were like this great influence in the world, but they had the capability in the 1990s under bin Laden's initial leadership. They were a major thorn in the American side, and of course, there were many opportunities to get bin Laden that were passed up, maybe for reasons that we can later speculate on. Um, and of course, you can go back to the war in Afghanistan where bin Laden really cut his teeth with the whole jihad thing, and where he really got his funding and training, and later getting into it and getting into bin Laden's CIA ties. All this stuff has been done to death, including by us. So I won't bore you with those details again. But Al Qaeda in 2022, and I would say even going all the way back for like a decade, ever since Osama bin Laden's official assassination. Now, I would also say that bin Laden probably the kidney failure got him before the SEALs got him. If I'm being honest, just I don't have a
Yeah.
great like mountains of evidence to back that up, but just personal speculation. And again, I'm not going
Well,
to
I
argue
mean,
that full case right now, but
there are a lot of contradictions. Like somebody who will pop up later in the program is Jake Sullivan, and we spoke about Jake Sullivan very
wonderful
briefly.
guy. I love
To
him.
yeah, yeah.
Almost as good as Anthony
So
Blinken.
he's Biden's security chief. In the infamous WikiLeaks Clinton emails, do you know who it was that told um, Hillary Clinton that Al Qaeda are the good guys in Syria?
Sullivan, I'm assuming.
Yep, Sullivan. That
Uh,
was Jake Sullivan.
yeah, yeah.
So
Our
one of the
current national
reasons
security
why
advisor. He's as lovely as John Bolton. You gotta love him.
one of the reasons why like America or the American government deserves conspiracy theories, it deserves speculation, it deserves mistrust, is because of that statement. You have, I mean, the embassy bombings in Africa killed like over 247 people. 17 sailors on the USS Cole died. Like,
Yeah, these were
uh,
attacks on par with the attacks on Beirut back in the 80s.
yeah, and imagine, like, imagine saying they're the good guys in Syria. Like, they're capable, they're capable of anything if like after all of that they say, but in Syria they're the good guys. That's all you need to know, and that's why they will always deserve speculation, because it is an empire of lies.
Yeah, and even compared to other contemporary empires and other empires of the past, what you can say about those ones at least is that they had coherent imperial interests. Now, whether or not those were to the benefit of the population, that's a debate that I would say depends greatly on time and date. But point being is, the American empire is an empire, once again, to repeat the famous quote, an empire of lies, and also an empire of contradictions, which is kind of implied within the lies, but just a completely incoherent empire. Even if you believe that American hegemony should reign over the earth, which I personally don't, the way, like, even if you were somebody who wanted that, looking at it, you're not getting that by, again, supporting these splinter Al Qaeda groups in Syria to get one over on the Iranians or whatever. It's very petty, I think, is the word I'm looking for.
Mhm.
But getting back into Zawahiri, if I had to describe him, he was sort of the workhorse figure, whereas Bin Laden and or whoever his body double was at whatever time, whatever. Um, well, that was the public face. The one,
Chubby Obama.
yeah, yeah, whichever one, the kidney failure one, the fat one, whichever one they picked that week. I suppose they all just looked the same to us Western white people, which I'm not, no comment. They may or may not to me personally. Some people wouldn't exactly consider me white, but I won't get into the ceiling question on this show, at least not at this time. Um, but getting back to Zawahiri, he was the workhorse. He was the guy who plotted a lot of things. He was the main strategist, and of course, he was the guy who was picked to succeed Bin Laden, and probably had succeeded Bin Laden since the early 2000s, but at least officially since the 2011 thing. And some speculate that this is just news to say, look, Biden's getting the bad guys, just for a bump in the polls, like as if the average American could tell you who Zawahiri is, like the same way they could tell you Bin Laden, or as if the war on terror and Al Qaeda are the primary concerns of a country that is 21 years out from 9/11 and 1 year out from the failed war in Afghanistan, and also has a very bitter taste in their mouth from the past 20 years of the so called war on terror. So I really don't know what to make of this. I know the Department of Defense denied any involvement in it, while the CIA claimed credit, indirectly, again, using their allies, whether that be people in the media or their other shills or whatever they have. So apparently it was a CIA drone that did it. The story just reeks of, again, I would agree, just
Yeah.
something to justify that America's still a superpower because we can still take out some guy hiding out in Afghanistan. Especially in the face of the failure in Ukraine, in the face of the debacle in Taiwan currently ongoing, and in the face of a possible conflict once again in the Balkans, which we'll get into later in the show. But if I just had to say one thing about the Zawahiri, it just seems like a throwaway line, whether they got him or not. Even if they did get him, to say that, look, American military might is still unparalleled because we took out somebody that we've been hunting for 20 years or whatever, which I think would actually make the exact opposite case. But it just seems like, and I think everyone would agree with this, a big PR stunt, whether or not they actually even
Yeah,
got
yeah.
him.
Yeah, I mean, so much of America's strategy is PR. Like it is soft power. Most of it is soft power, right? With a few tangibles along the way.
Yeah, that's really, I suppose, all you could put to it. So, with that being said, there's not much else to say about this Zawahiri guy. So, as I said before, moving on to Kosovo, there was a situation earlier in the week where the police in Kosovo, because Kosovo doesn't really have a standing army or anything, got into a small skirmish with the Serbian border guards, and then Vucic came out and made statements about uh, the Serbian population still within Kosovo and say the Serbian state's responsibility to them. The Kosovars talked about, of course, what they usually do. We love NATO. We love the American Empire. We love whoever's supposed to be funding us this time around. And tensions were very high for a couple days there, but it more or less attention about that dropped off as news about Taiwan took over the media cycle. Which again, we'll get to Taiwan at the end of the show and that current dispute. And we touch on a little with Pelosi's apparent visit there, but the Kosovo situation, although we haven't heard much about it in the past couple days, was very pivotal. Now, there have been, of course, these ongoing tensions ever since it was split off from Serbia. I believe in '08 is when they finally officiated the project. But of course, throughout the '90s and throughout the early 2000s, with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the redrawing of borders in the Balkans, the question of Kosovo and its independence or whether it should remain in Serbia, um, when that was a hotly debated topic, um, I would say we're probably at the most tense point in the Balkans since then. And again, that's also getting some stuff with, for example, countries like Albania and what they now call North Macedonia, your humble homeland, trying to get into the European Union and seek further European integration. As that situation goes on, and as tensions are seemingly once again increasing between Kosovo and Serbia, and not to mention the entire debacle in Montenegro from last year when it came to the um, overthrow of that and the issues with the church and the issues with the identity of whether they're Montenegrins or Serbians or whatever their ethnic identity is supposed to be. So I would say just the Kosovo issue alone, a border skirmish wouldn't be enough to justify even talking about it at any great length. But combined with the past, say, 3 years in the Balkans, it's looking like the so-called stability that was bought in the 1990s, like most parts of the American Empire, is very quickly waning.
Yeah, and this whole issue, of course, is about some kind of a regulation for Serbs either living there or visiting who have Serbian license plates, and Kosovo wants them to change their license plates to Kosovar license plates. I mean, if they're coming from Serbia, that's a ridiculous request, right? So this is one way of them uh, of getting Serbs to say Kosovo nije Serbia. So Kosovo is not Serbia, and that's why you have to change your license plates. Okay, now it's fair to say that most countries don't even recognize Kosovo as a state, and the
Yeah, not
flare
even
up
most
did,
NATO countries. Like any country with the border dispute, for example, Spain with the whole Catalonia thing,
yeah.
does not recognize Kosovo. And you actually had the Spanish Prime Minister come out in support of Serbia, which was one of the funnier things that a key NATO member was doing that.
Yeah. I mean, he has his very pragmatic reasons why he's doing that, as he said, and now, yeah, Kosovo doesn't have a standing army, but it does have about 4,000 NATO troops there. And then, ironically, on the night of the escalation, Ukraine said, "We will send troops there to fight for the dignity of Kosovo and blah blah blah." And then just yesterday, they removed their troops from Kosovo.
Yeah, that's an interesting development to say the least.
You know, sometimes I think Arestovich is really in charge.
You know what? I hope so. Things might get a lot more fun if that's the case.
Literally my favorite character. um, so um, now the problem has been quelled fairly quickly. From what I saw, it appears that at least one Serb has been shot and probably killed. I can't confirm it, but that's what I saw on various sites. Serbs began to barricade themselves when Kosovar special police forces showed up, and NATO right away made a statement that they would, if anything happened, they would intervene, and you know which side they would intervene on. So there's really not much that Vucic can do. And this vote to force people to change their license plates has been held off. It was supposed to happen, I think, 1st or 2nd of August, and now it's been postponed to the 1st or 2nd of September. So it's been pushed back a month. But I mean, the Balkans are a powder keg, and chances are there are people in the Pentagon who want a second front or two fronts. And on top of the front that Russia's already engaged in Ukraine. And a humiliation of Serbia, Russia is unable to really do anything, would be a likely scenario. Um, Bosnia itself is also a potential problem. And
Oh, Bosnia
Bosnia,
once again is a complete powder keg.
yeah, Bosnia is even more complicated because even Croats want a chunk out of Bosnia. And Serbian presence and political power in Bosnia is far greater than in Kosovo. And let's say NATO presence is not as
And
large as it is in Kosovo.
and I've mentioned this before, but I think it's also worth noting about Bosnia when it comes to that. There's actually British plans from the British forces in the region because Bosnia, although not part of NATO, is a hub of NATO troops. British forces actually have contingency plans on taking out several key Bosnian Serb leaders if any conflict were to break out. So they are preempting this. They are arguably deeper involved, at least insofar as Bosnia is concerned, in the Balkans than even the United States is at that point.
Hmm.
And I would say, although this situation seemed to have been quelled, at least for the time being, that whether it's license plates or a myriad of different issues, as what happens with Kosovo, which still does have a significant Serbian minority living within its borders, that eventually this is going to have to come to a head. And as you were saying, they have NATO, the American Empire, whatever you want to call them, have all the motivation in the world at this time when Russia is engaged in Ukraine to open a second front and to start another fire and to take care of the situation with Serbia and to finally kneecap them. Because although they did a number on them in the 1990s, Serbia surprisingly is still relatively defined. I'm not going to say it was what it was maybe 30 years ago, but point being is it's still a thorn in the side, at least insofar as regional interests are concerned, that they've been looking for a way to neutralize, whether through ascension to the European Union and neutering them that way, or if it comes down to it, through brute force. Which at that point, if and I would actually say Bosnia is the more likely uh, flashpoint for this, as opposed to either Kosovo or even like Montenegro or any of these other um, surrounding areas. I would say a possible breakup of Bosnia, especially once you bring in the Croatian element, is probably the would be the impetus for this if there's going to be another flare up in the Balkans. Um, they would love that right now. I think they would love that right now. I don't think
Hmm.
they can afford to do that right now, because even though it would tie up Russia, even though it would possibly put a great strain on them, and maybe the strain that they're looking for in order to collapse or cut Russia down to size, um, there's the problem. The West doesn't have the ability to do it either at this time. I mean, they might have the ability to do it on paper, they might have the ability to do it on that, but I I think even just in terms of public perception, especially with all the stuff happening with Taiwan right now, Twitter liberals can only put so many flags within their names before they start to lose track of which one's which.
Right. And I should mention that the SNSD leader in Kosovo representing the Serbs, Milorad Dodik, he is scheduled to visit Putin in St. Petersburg for talks. This happened, I believe, it happened before the attack uh, that happened in Kosovo. So, um, what he's going. I mean, it was, except for emphasizing that, he doesn't believe that he plays any role in the war in Ukraine. It's none of their business. Yada yada yada. They're going to discuss all sorts of things, right? So, um, yeah, I just thought that was something interesting to mention.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that until you had brought it up, but I would certainly keep an eye on the Balkans right now. I mean, even just going back through recent history, I mean, just the past century, 2 centuries, it always has been a flashpoint because it's once again at that crossroads of civilization.
Yeah.
And the situations, while they may be temporarily quelled, I do not believe in the slightest are over there. And even if you want to consider like Romania up into Moldova, the Balkans, which I know some people do, you have that situation. You have Transnistria. That entire stretch down from Ukraine into the Balkans is a massive flashpoint. And as I've said since about 2019, once again 2019, 2019, can't shut up about 2019. There's real potential for serious conflict there, and of course with that serious proxy conflict. And I certainly don't see an out. I doubt you do. I doubt any of you do. Um, and unfortunately, I think there are a lot of outstanding issues that can only be resolved, at least insofar as things have come to now, through force of arms with the triumph of either one side or another.
Mm.
But that's all I had for the debacle in the Balkans, and I suppose we can move it over to the minutia minute, in which case I remembered to get a map of the battlefield this time because I'm never sure whether to put it up, whether it's just crap on the screen or whether it's something that's actually a visual aid. So sometimes I just don't do it. But if you guys like the maps, here they are. Just of course you can tell me whether you like it or not, and I'll just gauge the responses and really just you know do kind of a straw poll. I might put up an actual poll, seeing if you guys want it. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to give us a situation report for the current ongoings in Ukraine.
Okay, so I'm going to break tradition. I'm going to start from the north and work my way east and then west and then south. So there's been a lot going on. Some more territory has been gained, but not as much as you would expect. But what has been gained has been actually pivotal, and there's some important decision making on the part of the Ukrainians that has already proven to have bit them in the derriere, as it were. But with no further ado, we'll begin with Kharkov. So there is fighting in the Kharkov front, and particularly north of Kharkov, and then moving south of it on the east side. Um, Russian forces are basically fighting in Pitomnik, Vasily, Rudyanka, and Gusarovka. Now, there were reports that the Russians had taken over this pivotal town in Gusarovka, but apparently that hasn't happened. So there is intense fighting back and forth for this town. Um, the intensity of the fighting, however, is not really as it is in Donbass. This town, however, is still important because it's this halfway point between Kharkov and the Izium. Izium is a one of the early successes that the Russians had. They took it fairly quickly, and it became a launch pad to take over Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Uh, and it would be pivotal because it would cut off one of the highways that connects Kharkov with the Donbass, particularly the northern Donbass, where there is a lot of fighting and some ground has been taken by the Russians. Um, Further down, if we talk about Protopopovka, there was an assault group of the 58th Brigade of the Ukrainians. Now, they tried to take some ground around Lake Liman. Again, this is at the Izium front, and they suffered fairly large losses. I don't know what that means exactly. In the end, it forced them to retreat. Um, but now where the thick of the action is happening, Seversk, which is just in the north, just south of Izium and just west of Lysychansk, has been fairly quiet. There have not been, I mean, there is fighting, of course. The Ukrainians are still on those hills, but it's not an area where the Russians seem to be focused. And now this is the part about where there might have been a miscalculation on the Ukrainians. And I think it has to be said at this point that it's probably the Pentagon. There have already been articles like in the Atlantic saying that is it time like when an American publication says is it time for America to to take greater control over Ukraine? Is their way of saying actually that's already happened. Like again, the illusion is always like it's a consideration. This neutral journalist came up with this idea based on his analysis. Maybe the Pentagon will read it. Like it's so absurd. Anyways, um, so that is happening, and there is, I think, also a tug of war. Um, the Great Kherson effective, front for to retake Kherson from the Russians by the Ukrainians has not happened. There have been small attempts. There have been tiny villages that they have fought over that have gone back and forth, but there's been no significant ground taken. Now, the Russians are sending in a lot of troops in this area. And the Ukrainians suspect that they're going to go for a town called Kryvyi Rog, which means crooked horn. And this town is Zelensky's childhood town. So this might explain the tug of war because he has asked for artillery to be moved into this area in order to retake Kherson, but has actually said this will be a limited attack and is actually going to be more to protect Mykolaiv and Kryvyi Rog. Mykolaiv is one of the, it's a shipping port. It's where during the Soviet era, and even before that, in the Tsarist era, where boats were manufactured. We mentioned way back near the start of the war and a little bit after that the Brits, of course, have an investment into the port there, which a lot of it is destroyed because the Ukrainians use it as an off ramp to supply troops both to the southern front and the eastern front in Ukraine. And this is where you hear the horrific stories of Russian missiles taking out barracks in the middle of the night, and sometimes there are dozens, sometimes apparently there are 100 or more that are killed. So, um, because of the movement of this artillery from the northern Donbass and from central Donbass around where um, Donetsk is located, the Russians have now found holes. Last week, I said that they were closing in on the outskirts of Marinka, Avdiivka, and Pesky. Pesky has been taken. Part of Marinka has been taken as well as a large portion of Avdiivka. The important thing about this is if they take this, this will force the Ukrainians to stop, to retreat further back, but also make it more difficult for them to hit Donetsk. In the last 2 days, 5 people have been killed from the shelling. One shell fell near the hotel in downtown Donetsk. Today, a shell fell right on a bus. So in 2 days, 3 adults and 2 children have been killed. Um, the other important thing about it, of course, is if they take this area, the road to Bakhmut or Kramatorsk, that the Russians call it, they will have a southern push now. But to the north, around Bakhmut, is a town called Solidar. The Russians have also apparently taken Solidar or taken part of it, but they have continued to move and are now finally on the outskirts of Bakhmut. So if people can imagine, we all remember when the Russians took over Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Then you have, imagine like a fan, a blade as it were, and it runs from Seversk down to Bakhmut, down to around basically where Donetsk is. Then there's another fan that's further west, and that is Slavyansk, and I forget some of the other. Konstantinovka is another one. That's another fan. After this point, there are very few towns. And when I say towns, many of these towns, they're all industrial towns. Some of them have power generators. Some of them make, aluminum or steel. Like they have industrial areas that are actually quite good for troops to hide in because they're built to withstand a lot of punishment. Even some of the blocks that were made during the Soviet era, these little 5-story apartments, are designed, for what the Soviets thought would be a nuclear war. So, um, you know, after this, we don't know, anything can happen. So let me continue. Sorry. Yes, I mentioned Solidar. So okay, so there's a few clarifications I have to make. We've discussed on the show that most of the fighting is in this area is being done by the LNR and the DNR, right? The Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. But apparently, a fighter has said, and this was a letter that was written to the guys on the Duran, that's not actually the case. He said, we're fairly well integrated with the Russian military, and a lot of the Russian military is participating with us. Yes, they're supplying tanks. Yes, they do almost not all of it, but most of the artillery, and of course the Air Force is entirely of the Russians.
Yeah, I think
But
it's worth noting that, of course, over the past 8 years, that Russian forces, especially with volunteers, have been heavily integrated into these militia groups. I mean, it's fundamentally what they were for about 8 years before the conflict actually broke out, but they've been well integrated into these separatist forces. So it's no surprise that the integration is more or less complete at this point.
yes, and I made a mistake earlier. I meant to say Bakhmut is sometimes called Artemovsk. I got it mixed up with Kramatorsk. So uh, now the other group that's fighting with them, we know about the Chechens, and they tend to be very good fighters, and they've done very well. But the other group that's been doing extremely well, and they're the reason for some of these breakthroughs, is Wagner. PMC Wagner is the one that captured most of Solidar and now is fighting in the eastern streets of Bakhmut. So these are like most of the this is where the most amount of intense fighting is happening. Um, Now in Zaporozhye region, there hasn't been. I mean, there's always constant back and forth skirmishes. Is something we should note, but it's not quite at the same intensity. In the southern region, we have in the Kherson. So um, it's been kind of a hit and miss. You know, early on when the Ukrainians uh, were bombing the bridges, they had quite a bit of success. Now they didn't knock out any bridges, but they did damage them to such an extent, like the one Antonovsky, that the Russians couldn't use it for civilian traffic. As far as I'm aware, military is still allowed to go on it, but not civilians. So civilians are using rafts basically to transport their cars back and forth across the river. And the company that built the famous bridge linking Crimea to the Russian mainland has now arrived and is going to repair the Antonovsky Bridge. Now you're wondering, okay, but is it safe? Well, see, that's the thing about a mixed bag, right? So I think there was early on when they were using the HIMARS, most of the HIMAR missiles got through. The Russians knocked out two or three. Then there was one where they knocked out 12, but the one that received the most, the strike by the Ukrainians that received the most amount of damage by the Antonovsky Bridge and other bridges, um, uh, there were 12 missiles, and the Russians did not even bother to intercept them. However, from what I'm reading, 12 missiles this time were intercepted. To me, that indicates either it's a HIMAR with maybe like the German Mars type that has like 12 tubes that can fire the missiles, or it's two HIMAR units firing, right? Or they have enough time to reload, and that's what's going on. Because the basic HIMAR that the Ukrainians are getting has just six missiles or rockets that they can fire at once. Now, Ukrainian authorities have actually finally admitted that the Russians claim six, but the Ukrainians have admitted that five HIMAR units have been destroyed by the Russians. So that's it for basically for the southern front. The other thing is three more container ships leaving Odessa with corn have gone to Turkey, and they're being inspected right now. So far, there have not been any incident with floating mines. No weapon caches have been found. Uh, that part seems to be going fairly well, and it's not going to give the Russians any brownie points, let's say, in Western media, of course. But for Russian media, this will give them, in terms of PR, a more humanitarian face. But as long as we are talking about PR, we should talk about maybe like one of the biggest stories that has come out. and that is the criticism by Amnesty International of the Ukrainians placing their armor and their soldiers in and around schools and hospitals. And Amnesty International saying this is a violation of human rights, and scores of civilians have died as a result of it. Sarah, the transgender journalist in Kharkov, on Twitter, jumped on a destroyed armored personnel carrier, I'm presuming belonging to the Russians, and said Ukraine is still free, and uh, Amnesty International is a fascist Russian organization.
It really is a war of the 21st century, and that's on top of course, Zelensky ramrodding recognitions of civil partnership for gay couples. So it's truly a real 21st century conflict with the
Yeah.
proxy state of the American Empire fighting against the evil fascist Russian Amnesty International. Um, I mean, I think that just says it all, doesn't it?
It really does. Now, the interesting thing about this report is just the day before, Borrell no, Guterres of the UN had actually criticized the Ukrainians for firing salvos of pedal bombs. These are like, they are kind of shaped like pedals. They're small, they're plastic. They won't kill you, but they will blow your foot off and they will kill pets and children. And so they've showered Donetsk City with them. And basically, these towns that I'm talking about, Avdiivka, Marinka, uh, as they're pulling out, they're firing salvos into these towns in order to slow the advance of the Russians. Um, some of the some of the replies from it's outrageous from the Ukrainians is it's still the fault of the Russians. Like,
Oh, naturally.
yeah. Uh, they made us do this, and so on and so on. And other than as I'm just going to keep going with PR, and the craziest thing I saw is um, Lindsey Graham literally almost repeated that line about we're going to keep fighting to the last Ukrainian. He basically said, um, 4 months in, and I'm liking the structure of this war. The military and economic aid that we're giving Ukraine is proven that Ukrainians will fight to the last person. I like how he was sensitive not to say man or woman.
Oh yes, just the abstract person, including our LGBTQCI friends. Like, what did you say her name was? Sarah something on top.
Sarah, I forget her last name. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
it's just so grotesque.
Including brave fighters like that, naturally.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, she's the one that bragged, or he's the one that bragged that I helped capture Gonzalo Lira.
Oh, that
But
whole fiasco! That feels like a lifetime ago. But yeah,
doesn't it?
these you
Can
know
you believe that was April?
it is once again truly the 21st century war.
Yes, yes. So two more things I'll say about Ukraine in the minutia minute is this is very recent. The Daryevsky Bridge across the Ingulit River has been hit. Apparently, it's damaged. The Russians have actually managed to find many ways to transfer equipment, primarily the one in Novokhovka. This is a train. This is a rail system that runs right over the dam. That one is working just fine. I think a lot of this stuff is honestly inflated. Uh, the Russians have a lot of ability to transfer the stuff over the river. They have quite a buffer. They have a beachhead of several, uh, 100 kilometers, so they're not really, I don't think, worried about that. But the craziest thing is today. This is the part I forgot about Zaporozhye, and I can't believe it. Is the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye has been hit again. And immediately Zelensky blamed this on the Russians. Just like last week, he blamed the death of something like 53 Azov fighters and possibly Marine fighters uh, at a prison, basically, at a military prison, on the Russians. That they're holding them there for 3 months, and then they decide, oh, we'll just liquidate them. Like, I mean, they could have done that ages ago. Uh, I mean, if you're going to keep the whole narrative, evil Putler, and that he's going to take over the all of Europe and so on. So um, this, I mean, I find this actually quite scary because unlike last time, this damage is more severe. Apparently, one of the reactors is slightly damaged, and there's a potential for things to get out of hand. I think maybe one of the only reassuring things is, and again, we don't know if Zelensky is giving these orders, and that is he immediately blamed the Russians. I find that actually encouraging because, in a way, that's saying, okay, we can dodge this one. We'll blame it on the Russians. Everyone will believe us anyways. But that's, to me, I read that as him saying, don't do this again. Whether he'll be heated or not, I don't know. But that's what I think. I think that's his cue because he spoke very quickly. He wasn't quiet about it. Sometimes the Ukrainians, when they have a successful hit, sometimes they're very quiet about it. Sometimes they immediately show you video footage, although we don't see that a lot now. But that's my take, and that's it for the minutia minute.
I will once again reiterate Lindsey Graham's words, or at least paraphrase him. Is this fighting really going to go on to the last man? Because I listen to you week after week, and our audience also listens to you week after week. Give these, very detailed, to your credit, reports on the ground situation in Ukraine. And it seems like it always keeps going in the same direction, which is in Russia's favor. And especially this week, when it comes to the, I know you said they were moving in on the industrial towns, which will give some of the Ukrainian fighters better opportunities to hide. But once again, there were those numbers that came out that Russia has captured the bulk of the industrial capability of Ukraine at this point, and it's now under their control. And the story you just had about the Zaporizhia power plant.
By the
And
way, this is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe.
yes, and you'll recall back in, I believe it was March, towards the beginning of the war, the Russians were blamed for striking it when it turned out to be Ukrainian forces. And yes, biggest nuclear power plant still in operation too. And I concur with what you were saying about the Zelensky comments, that it was more or less a don't do this, stop doing this. But that again comes down to how much control Zelensky has as a commander in chief over the Ukrainian forces versus individual officers and other elements within the Ukrainian military, which I would wager at this point, if Zelensky had that much control over the Ukrainian military, the fighting would probably be less intense. We'd probably be looking at maybe not exactly a ceasefire, but something that may lead up to that. Because again, I it's foreign aid that's keeping the Ukrainian military going. It's foreign aid that is
Keeping the
distributed.
economy going.
It's keeping just keeping the entire country going. Um, because at this point, again, the Ukrainian economy has been shifted to a war economy. Everything's shut down. Whatever power they had on the world stage economically has, of course, evaporated as a country at war, as tends to happen, as we've saw happen in places like Syria, Iraq, etc. But it once again comes down to it is a multi-faction problem in Ukraine that I don't believe Zelensky can pursue any sort of talks of even a ceasefire without having
No,
rival elements either overthrow, if not just outright assassinate him. So,
I think there's a reason. I think there's a reason for this, and Mark Sleboda, I have to give him credit for. He mentioned this. Now on the show, I've said many times that the strategy of fighting in Ukraine, when they know that they're going to lose the town, is to have the town utterly destroyed and then move out, so that all of eastern Ukraine is left in ruins that the Russians will have to pay in order to revitalize. Now, as we look at Mariupol, there are 12,000 workers there. Before the end of the year, there will be 30,000. And it will be revitalized. Unfortunately, I think the Azovstal plant is finished. This is, I think, very unfortunate because it's one of those hard jobs. Like, I don't mean difficult to do, although it is part of that. Um, they're going to replace it with some kind of, I don't know, retail. Like, it's a terrible idea. Um, I've been to Russia. Russians hate service jobs. I mean, a lot of people do, but in my experience, they really despise them. Now, um, so what did Mark Sloboda say? I've always said that the whole point is to have all of these places in ruin. If they're going to lose the East, they're going to make sure the East is utterly destroyed. From a Ukrainian point of view, I can see them, um, making peace with that.
Oh, it's the definition of scorched earth. And
Yeah,
again, especially when a lot of these fighters aren't from eastern Ukraine, and with the tensions in Ukraine, how the different regional ice groups view each other, them torching and going scorched earth in parts of eastern Ukraine, especially for a lot of these western and central fighters, probably doesn't weigh too much on their hearts or their conscience. Now, I'm not saying
no,
that they're all soulless about it, but point being is they feel much less of that. As we've discussed previously, it's much more foreign to them than say either western or central Ukraine with that. But uh, yeah,
right, but
that I
but
mean it completely follows that it's going to be scorched earth, that they're going to make Russia
yeah,
pay to rebuild this and pay to integrate this, and I suppose it really is the only thing that a losing military can do is just make the victory as costly as possible for the pursuing force. Which I mean, this isn't the first time we've ever seen anything like this, but I
right,
once again
but
find myself asking how much longer can this continue before it just falls apart. I mean, we're just over 5 months, and in the next few weeks, we'll be approaching the 6 month mark of this war, and there are still so many unanswered questions.
right. Now I think now this is the I what I think is the American strategy that I don't think many Ukrainians can make their peace with, and that is in the way that Eastern Ukraine is going to be destroyed. Any conscript from any place in Ukraine, including those that they can dig up in the east, and that has happened, right? These guys don't want to fight for Ukraine, but let's say from central and western, because we know we've seen the videos where they're trying to round up people from western Ukraine. Um, what they do want massive, massive casualties because for every dead Ukrainian soldier will be a family that will forever hate Russia.
Oh yes,
That's the American
yeah.
strategy.
There's creating
It's
that
the
resentment
only
on the
way
ground.
to keep and intensify the ethnic hatred towards Russians. There cannot be like um, there are probably many Ukrainians that don't want the Russians to be there, that see the way things are unfolding and think maybe something, maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we'll have it better. We'll have it over them. Or, an arrangement will come about where we'll prosper and it won't matter. Uh, Russia won't matter as much. It'll be in the past. Like all of that has to be put aside. And so the death of as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible is the guarantee that they need for a kind of virulent hatred throughout the society for
Oh,
Russia.
both at home and abroad, because of course they
Yeah,
can stoke the tensions within Ukraine and build an ethnic resentment against the Russians, and then they can point to the world saying the Russians look at the terrible atrocity they've committed, blah blah blah, as the story goes.
yeah.
Um,
But my gut feeling is very few Ukrainians, even in command, want this like that. Um, there's been a row several times between Zelensky and I forget his name, Zelensky, the Zulu, like his military commander. I get a feeling that his chief of staff or his general does not want this. He's like his general staff has always wanted like to retreat to an area that they can defend, and this has always been unacceptable. But the reason he wants that is because he doesn't want to see an entire generation wasted, because he doesn't see Ukrainians ever coming back. But the American point of view is the Ukrainian refugees, which are flooding into Europe, over 6.5 million now, is irrelevant. What you want is the to continue the ancestral and ethnic hatred of Russians for at least another 2, 3 generations.
Oh, naturally. I mean, especially from the point of view of a foreign power stoking on this war, it's they're not sending their men to fight and die, so it's of course it's ideal for them. Whereas, as you were saying, even the Ukrainians, no matter how bloodthirsty they may be against Russians or however strong the ethnic tensions or ethnic hatred may run, at the end of the day, they still realize that they're the ones being sent into the meat grinder.
Yes, and um, I think August the 3rd was particularly bad. Even Zelensky went on air to say that they had lost probably 1,000 men in 24 hours. That's what it took to take parts of Marinka, Pesky, Avdiivka, Soledar. That's what it took.
I mean, I'm gonna outright say, and referencing the Henry Kissinger statements that were made um, about a month and a half ago, probably about 2 months ago at this point, is that
Yeah.
really there's no way out of this, and I'll say once again, much like Syria, without coming to the bargaining table. And also, to quote Orban, it's going to have to be a negotiation between the United States and Russia that ends this war. Ukraine is simply a proxy player of the United States and NATO at this point. I don't think that's controversial in the slightest to say.
Yeah. The question is, America cannot come to an agreement. This really is their Armageddon. This really is whether the empire survives or not. They cannot afford a loss in Ukraine or a loss of face.
Yes, and I know
Uh,
that one thing that we've been saying throughout the span of the war during the show is that it's a fight for the Western lifestyle versus a Russian fight for their lives. But at this point, I think it's becoming a fight for the West, at least as we know its life.
yeah. Um, and I mean, I know we're going to move on to Taiwan, and I think that's
And then I also do have
part
a
of the reason why Pelosi went to Taiwan.
I have a bit about Taiwan, but first I just do have a few things, and I'll move on from that because I feel like the Ukraine topic has been sufficiently covered. So, just briefly, tensions are rising between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It is predicted that that conflict will flare up again, and naturally, much like the Kosovo situation, it would be very beneficial for the American empire right now to try to open up another front to distract Russia. And I would keep your eye on that for the time being. And then, also briefly, Orban, speaking of, was at CPAC. He met with Trump and he gave some interesting speeches, particularly involving, let's just say, one of the quotes that stuck out to me, which I thought was pretty funny, is "The globalists have gone to hell, while I have gone to Texas." And like it's Orban speaking like fluent English, but like with his Hungarian accent, so it's actually very entertaining to listen to, which I would encourage you all to listen to for the time being. And CPAC, I'm sure you all know, is the very mainstream conservative conference where they bring up, conservative politicians, conservative talking heads, whatever. And it usually focuses on the stuff like free markets and, vague concepts of Americanism that don't really touch at, what the heart of a nation is. But with, of course, the passing comments to social and cultural conservatism. So Orban's statements about, again, the family structure were a breath of fresh air. I doubt it's going to influence the American right to any great action or to resemble the Hungarian right in any sense, so I'm not getting my hopes up, but I do think it's worth pointing out that ideas like Orban are getting to the point where they could even have a stage at CPAC. And Orban Well, of course, he did do what he does and appeal to a more Western audience, as he sometimes does. He didn't back down from a lot of his more civilizational rhetoric that you've become accustomed to over these past couple of years. So that was a breath of fresh air. And then some news out of the energy markets is that Nord Stream 1, once again, for maintenance. The turbines, Russia's saying we can't send them for maintenance to the EU, UK, or Canada because of the sanctions. So once again, that is continuing on as usual. In which case, energy flow to Europe will likely be shortened. And then also, we have a story of Russia importing oil into Egypt, which then gets sent to Europe via Egypt, which allows these countries to circumvent their own sanctions that they tried to put on Russia to, you know, backfire against Russia. And it was also pointed out to me, I saw this, that Russia was forced to default on its debt, but the only thing that's happened thus far because of the sanctions is that Russia has just had its slate wiped clean, and there's been no outside consequences beyond that because of once again the backfiring sanctions. And then uh, the last piece of energy news I have before we get to Taiwan is that Saudi Arabia is raising oil prices in September for the entirety of Asia. So expect energy prices to go up as a result of that. And um, once again, I think that was to be expected. And we will likely have more news about the current situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan as it unfolds. So you could probably look forward to that next week if any major event happens, because once again, that's going to be one of the fires they're going to try to stoke to try to open up a second front, similar to what they're trying to do in the Balkans right now. But getting on to the China-Taiwan situation, so Pelosi did go through with her trip, and those Chinese cruise missiles did not find her aircraft or her escorts. And I know some of you probably are a bit upset about that. I will refrain from giving a personal feelings of mine on that. But it has resulted in a great escalation between China and Taiwan. Now, China has cut off whatever trade they had with the island. They have begun military operations. They have, especially navally, they've done what North Korea typically does to Japan and South Korea, which is fire missiles over the island. So it has become a major posturing. And last week, when we had discussed this, we had said, of course, with the sizable pro Beijing faction in Taiwan, it probably wouldn't come to conflict yet. I still maintain that these are just exercises, these are just shows of force, and it likely will not come to combat anytime in the near future. Now, I could be wrong about that, but it has gotten a response from the American Empire, particularly from the Pentagon. So there were requests made to the Pentagon that HIMARS and other military aid and equipment be curtailed, if not outright ceased to Ukraine, in order to give them to Taiwan because that front is opening up. And as you were speculating at the beginning of the show, with the more or less Western failure in Ukraine, Taiwan with Pelosi has become the new posturing. They need to show that they are really what they say they are, and it's not all just talk, not all just soft power and bluff, that they are able to project power against a foreign adversary, which, once again, returning to the beginning of the show, I think was part of the Zawahiri debacle that went on this week.
Mhm.
But it does look like they are gearing up at least for a showdown in Taiwan. Now, a showdown over the Taiwan Straits hasn't been unheard of. We had this in the 1990s, which was a handy American PR victory. China balked pretty quickly. Granted, the dynamics between the U.S. and China in the 90s, especially with the relationship they had coming out of the Cold War, out of the 1980s, out of even going all the way back to Nixon's opening up of diplomatic relations with China, we're in a vastly different situation than any of that. So China all of a sudden balking this time isn't likely. I doubt it will escalate into outright conflict this time around. And the U.S., while they are trying to project this strong image against Taiwan, it really is what happens all the time, where it's just these empty words and maybe some promise of military aid. And it also brings into question the U.S. China policy because, once again, ever since Nixon, we have not had an official diplomatic relationship with the Taiwanese. We cut off their recognition as the Republic of China and give it to the People's Republic of China. And we are still very economically intertwined to the point where, although that is starting to shift, there isn't room, at least in my opinion at this point, for a complete divorce of the economies that would be needed in order for a conflict to break out. Now, maybe you'll get some sort of proxy conflict where it goes back and forth. There's some sanctions, and some people are eager to compare this to the Crimea situation back in 2014. I wouldn't go that far. At this point, I don't think we're looking at any sort of escalation beyond Chinese military posturing. Now, if the Chinese wanted to really force a bargaining situation, I've heard some people say, well, of course they could always just blockade the island. They could just use that raw amount of force. However, I think that escalation might be enough to garner a something of a U.S. response, or at least a regional response, whether that be from a U.S.-backed Japanese effort or whatever. But at this point, I think it's just a lot of posturing on both sides. I think the U.S. And I'm gonna make this accusation that people usually make about China towards the U.S. I think the U.S. is a bit of a paper tiger in this case, sending Pelosi. Of course, China didn't follow through with its threats, which isn't to be expected. The threats were the kind of threats that you make that you don't follow through on. They were the very hyperbolic kind. Not I'm not saying that China is some like China won't back down to any challenge, but point being is, I don't think anyone ever believed that Pelosi's plane was going to be knocked out of the sky by a Chinese missile. And I think anyone who is
Hmm.
trying to paint that situation is just being intentionally obtuse at that point. But with all that being said, I think there is clearly one party in this that looks like an absolute fool, and that would be um, particularly the American Empire side of this. And if you want a central figure to look at, it would be Nancy Pelosi.
Right. I mean, I think the only thing I will say, and it's something I thought about, and I'm looking for what other people are saying on various blogs, and Andrei Martyanov, he did say something, because the Chinese have lost face here, and they wouldn't have lost face if they just ignored her going. But and no, the Chinese never said that they were going to shoot her plane out of the sky. They said it's a red line. There will be severe consequences for this. But what they also did was, now I know I think they had military schedule, like military exercises scheduled. So I don't know how much of all of this is a show, right? Um, but one of the things he said was, the Chinese showed their guns and they didn't use them, and they've lost face. But to that, I would say also that the moment of losing face will come and go, because China has, like, within hours of her even landing there, and even an hour or so before she left and thereafter, they already have started the withdrawal of various items that they trade with them, particularly sand. Now, sand is important for construction, but TMSC, the biggest chip manufacturer in the world, also needs sand from processing for creating microchips for their construction. And we know there's already a shortage, because we discussed how neon is important, and neon is not getting through because 90% of the world's neon is in Ukraine.
Well, I did pick up an interesting fact in regard to the microchip industry. Now, before it was outsourced to Taiwan, do you know where the largest producer of microchips in the world used to be?
I don't know.
In New Jersey.
Really?
Yeah, in New Jersey. So we have a case once again, and you've heard this story time and time again, where an industry that America leads the world in the 80s, in the 90s, becomes a bit too costly. Well, not even too costly, but cuts a bit too much into the profit margins to keep it domestic, keep the products high quality as a former first world nation like the United States used to be able to produce, and ships it off to somewhere in East Asia that can do it for cheaply, but make a, let's be honest, objectively lower quality product, and while the usual suspects get to make a fortune off of it. So once again, you have the offshoring to China proper, to Taiwan. India is now becoming a source of that, and I fear as well, maybe now with the whole Russia conflict, the love affair between the American establishment and trying to court India, maybe that will hopefully dissipate as a result of this. One can only hope. But it's a tale as old as the American Empire itself. You're bribing these smaller satellite states to join your coalition to become a vassal of you by taking an industry, a vital industry, mind you, especially in the technological era, taking it out of the heartland, out of somewhere where it's more or less secure. I mean, again, you're much less likely to have hostile boots in New Jersey than you are in Taiwan. Let's be honest about that. You're taking that, you're taking away, quality jobs from Americans, whether that be working directly in the industry or one of the support industries, whether that be just anyone who works for any of these companies that might manufacture something like that, and you're bribing these countries for a temporary loyalty that they will only demand more and more, as you see time and time again. We give them this trade deal, we give them this industry, and of course, next round of negotiations, it's always asking for more, and they get that because we can't risk this one island falling into Chinese hands or this one post-Soviet statelet uh, getting cozy with Russia. And going back to the Empire of Lies and the Empire of Contradictions, it's a fundamentally incoherent foreign policy from any rational point of view, even from the point of view if you want to dominate the world, if you want Washington, D.C. to be the axis on which the world spins. I mean, you might be buying that short term, but long term, what the hell are you doing?
Right, right. And besides, like, of course, China's, they're now they've cut talks for international crime, for climate change, uh, but really, the, the the bigger stuff, of course, is they have cut ties with the Department of Defense, and that's a big deal. And they've also cut ties and communication for regional military command
And I think it's
with the
also
U.S.
worth pointing out that over the past couple of years, especially with the recent lockdowns in Beijing, about I think that was at the beginning of this year, end of last year, that within the Chinese Communist Party there has been a cleanup of what is called the Shanghai faction, which are the faction who were much more eager to have an intertwined relationship with the United States, and that's been going on since about 2017.
Mhm.
So certainly the divorce between China and America is happening, and I would say at a much faster rate than I expected, which makes this Taiwan question all the more incoherent because I can guarantee you, and not that I think we should, that we will never change recognition of China to Taiwan ever again. That ship has sailed. It makes absolutely no sense. Now, maybe we're going to try some sort of so called two state solution, but I have a feeling the Taiwanese question is going to be resolved much sooner than I initially thought. I don't think this current spat is going to escalate into any sort of conflict or any sort of pivotal move, but I I think it's more or less you know set the course of what we're going to be looking at for the next several years when it comes to Taiwan. I think we've passed a point of no return with it.
Right. I mean, China, Xi Jinping, anyways, I can say for him, Xi Jinping said that a peaceful integration of Taiwan and China will happen by 2049. Okay, so that's like 30 years from now, right? Now that process will be sped up, right? You can tell that China is China doesn't want to speed this up, quite frankly, right? They were expecting a peaceful integration to happen long term. In other words, Taiwan would be wooed. Its economy is already heavily tied in. Its biggest trading partner is China, and so they expected a very gradual integration. However, part of it is the Western Aligned Party that got in. Its name escapes me. That's the one that brought in gay marriage. It's literally the only place that has gay marriage in Asia. Um, I think they're separatists. Many people, I would say, like half the population, perhaps see themselves as Taiwanese, as a kind of a new identity, but the other half do not. Um, in any case, this process of integration has now been sped up, and again, the Americans feel that if a war happens, that'll be good. And the reason it'll be good is every, Chinese Taiwanese that dies fighting against mainland China, there'll be hate for the Chinese
Once
long
again,
term.
like Ukraine, building that
Yeah,
ethnic resentment.
right, right. So that is what they want, right? So the war had to be sped up. China lost face. They always knew China wasn't going to blow up, Nancy Pelosi's plane out of the sky, but they showed their military anyways, and you know, uh, the Americans just flaunted their power, and so now China must do something. It very similar to now Russia must do something. They started shelling Donetsk and Lugansk in a very intensive way for 5 days before uh, Putin on the 22nd announced, the recognition of Lugansk and Donetsk republics, and then 2 days after that, and the shelling still continued. Uh, the invasion happened. So uh, America needs to speed these things up, and this is why they've done this, because in a sense it's America that needs more time.
Yes, and although it goes against the conventional analysis, while the future certainly does hold a myriad of problems for both Russia and China, compared to the United States and compared to the American Empire, time is on their side.
Right, right, and that's why it had to be interrupted, right? Like, um, I mean, it's why I think like the doves in Russia's government in 2014, including Putin, wanted to resolve the Ukraine crisis in a peaceful way. I mean, it wasn't going to happen, but that is what they were hoping for. And I think very quickly after you know, I think definitely by 2015, they probably were already in talks with China that this was inevitable. And really, this Taiwan debacle, like, is the Russians now that have come out on top in terms of diplomatic relations with China. This is
And as we
only
saw
going to
last week,
cement
the
the
American
relationship.
Empire begging Europe to divest from China.
Yeah, I mean, that's the next step, right? The next step is going to play the sanctions game with China. And this is going to be several magnitudes worse.
I
So the
mean,
ties
it's
between Russia and China are very well cemented right now. Uh, there is no way these two are going to be separated. Not now. And with the war in Ukraine going very poorly for the West and for the U.S., really the next option is to sit back and wait and see how well they can, deliver the arms to Taiwan. Now, America, I for America to prevent the Chinese from taking Taiwan, they will have to get involved. And the reason I say this is, the American submarine fleet is arguably the best fleet in the world. Some argue it's the Russians. It's superlative. It is an excellent fleet. They have lots of blue water submarines, very capable of making strikes from a long distance, very quiet. Taiwan, of course, has, I think, two or three submarines. I mean, Taiwan is going to get steamrolled to have tanks that are not nearly as good as the Chinese. And all that talk about, yes, I know China's military hasn't been tested, but they have a lot of it, and Taiwan doesn't.
I
So
mean,
the Americans,
going all the way back to 2013, that it was cemented that it was always going to lead up to this point. Now there were several points along that road, and I would say the Trump era was especially critical
Mm.
in order to prevent this Russian-Chinese alliance. And now the Americans have left themselves at a point where their only option is either look like absolute fools or implement hard power. Hard power that we've seen in war games with both Russia and China would lose.
Right. So the reason I say America will have to get involved in Taiwan, okay, or at least, fight to the last Taiwanese, after that, maybe the last Japanese. The reason I say this is because rearming Taiwan will be extremely difficult. I don't think personally the Chinese are just going to storm the beaches. They're going to surround the island, which is what their exercise is doing right now. There's an effective informal blockade on Taiwan right now. And if you say that the Chinese are not very warlike and are more merchant-like, you can say that's even more so for the Taiwanese, or at least as much. Uh, and the population is much more divided 50-50, rather than, let's say, 70-30, 60, 35-65 or something like that, in Ukraine. So um, I would say that's why they would have to get involved, because there isn't a Poland where you can just keep funneling more and more weapons, and you've got 28 other countries. Some of them have nukes. That the first missile that lands in Poland, it's all over. Like, who knows what'll happen?
Yeah, there's no
It
East Asian NATO to fall back on.
Yeah, yeah. Like, where are they going to come from? Um, if there's a blockade, well, I mean, that's it. That's when they go to war. Uh, China already has lots of intercontinental ballistic missiles, anyways, that can destroy um, Taiwan from a distance. Of course, China doesn't want that. Particularly, it does not want the chip manufacturing to be destroyed. Um, but if this is going to be a kind of a gradual thing where we see a few years of sanctions against China, and again, in order to spur it into action, um, because again, in both scenarios, it seems like the Americans are in a hurry, which means time is more in favor against America. Why else would it be in a hurry, right? If it's in charge, and this is the status quo, there's something there that America is worried about in order to get these countries to fight each other.
Well, I think
So,
to return back to what we were discussing at the beginning of the show, if this, I mean, as we were discussing, Israel has painted itself into a corner, and the Iranians are, and
mm,
their proxy forces uh, are closing in. Syria looks like it's about to be brought to a tentative resolution, at least.
I mean, I think
Or like
Erdogan and
even
Putin are
regarding
working on that.
even regarding anything with Turkey as well. I mean, we're just one flare up in the Middle East away from the trifecta, where the three major focuses of the American empire are all flaring up. And what are they going to do at that point? I mean,
Yeah,
are we going to expect them to plunge the entire world into war? I like, as much as I think the American establishment is full of hawks. We got them; they're chicken hawks. I don't think they have the stomach to plunge the entire world into another war if it came down to it. Now, maybe this is just being too optimistic, but point being is, I think with the Ukraine situation, with China, Taiwan, if anything were to flare up in the Middle East, which there's a very real possibility, as we were discussing at the beginning of the show, um, I think that's checkmate for the American Empire. I know this is something that maybe 2 or 3 years ago I would have said the American Empire may be on a decline, but it'll probably be a long time before it actually declines. But I think we are one crisis away from a checkmate at this point.
hmm hmm of course, Josh Rogan of the Washington Post says in his opinion piece, the skeptics are wrong. The U.S. can confront China and Russia. Like, I mean, I think what worries a lot of people is, let's suppose at one point or another, China sinks an American carrier. I mean, who knows, right? Like, I mean, that's a big loss. That's a big loss. I mean, you're an American. What would you think would happen?
Well, it's it's I would say it's about a 50-50 whether it flares up the American public or twists our stomach to the point where we just want out of everything. And it's a coin toss.
Hmm. I mean, a lot of people would say, that stupid idiot got us into this. I'd like to take some time to just mention that, we lived through 4 years of Trump where we had to listen to, blue check marks and other shit libs go on and on about how, oh my God, Trump's going to get us all killed in World War III. I mean, they're literally quiet. It's literally crickets, right? It just shows you like it's like I can't take the Trump jab. It'll kill me. Biden is elected. Everybody better take this. We need this mandated. Like you can tell how insincere these people are.
Yeah, I mean it's pure loyalty to parties and personalities, which I mean, I'm not saying that's a uniquely American thing, but at this point, I would say the biggest thing preventing a real American war effort is just internal divisions. And again, we've talked about this on the show before. I think we talked about this on our 20th anniversary of 9/11 special. If an event were to happen on that same caliber, which, for example, a sinking of a carrier would be about that in terms of casualties, probably even more. If you look at the exact numbers, assuming casualty rates would be what you'd expect. There's no there's nothing that can make the American public unite the way it did, say, after Pearl Harbor, after 9/11. I mean, just getting down to the demographic question alone, and then getting down into the difference between worldviews have become irreconcilable. Let's say a carrier does go down in the South China Sea or in the Sea of Japan or the Taiwan Straits. You're going to have the significant minority of the population, including myself, saying, "Well, that's a false flag. They clearly
Mhm.
staged that. It's a queen sacrifice in order to get what they want." You're gonna have another group of the population that's gung ho, that's bloodthirsty. A group of the population that blames the current administration, in which case I'll probably also be involved in that for their stupid foreign policy. And then I think the underlying feeling that very few people will be willing to admit is that their stomachs are twisting at the thought of the United States getting involved in another major conflict.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great point.
Uh, like I said, even ignoring the war games, assuming America could muster that, could implement another draft will never happen. I mean, if Vietnam caused the problems, if it did, with the social and cultural and demographic state of 1960s America, 2020s America, boy, let me tell you, is none of those metrics have improved. In fact, they've gotten severely worse, in my opinion. And I know some people who are older might disagree with me, say, like, well, of course you didn't see it, you lived through it, so you can't really make that judgment. But I'll just say, based on my knowledge of the era and based on what I'm seeing right now, America has irreconcilable differences. And a lot of people would say that's red versus blue, but I would say there's several factions that even go beyond that, which is why I think the future of the United States as a functional, united polity, while there might not be an official dissolution, I frankly don't see it. It takes one system failure from the federal government, and that could be something on the world stage, in order for people in state governments or whatever to just throw their hands up and say we're done with the federal government. I mean, look at how close this whole um, inoculation issue has gotten us, and that's over. I mean,
Hmm.
don't get me wrong, I'm fully against the mandates, but compared to crises that could happen, it's pretty marginal. Like a medical mandate, while I'm not trying to downplay the severity and the people whose lives have been affected by it, the federal government can do a lot more divisive things than just that. And then you have the question of like Roe versus Wade. I know that's been something that's been in the mainstream for about half a century. And again, just a lot of the cultural questions. I know that we don't have the traditional ethnic divisions, say, that a lot of these other multi ethnic states may have had, but there's just irreconcilable differences. And the American empire, I think, even if it could form a wartime coalition, as it were, uh, just compared to what's happened to the military over the past 2 decades and comparing that to Russia and China, and once again going back to those 2018 war games, I think it's one crisis in the Middle East, and that's game over. And I know some people may accuse us of being the black pillars, of being the pessimists of when it comes to these sort of situations. But um, maybe I'm just wrong, but I see no way out of the current economic crisis. I see no way out of the current geopolitical crisis. I see no way out of the current cultural and political crisis. I mean, I know we've talked about the downfall of the American empire for years on the show in a more abstract sense, but I think it's becoming a more immediate sense that it's game over for the American empire, and there's really no other way to put it.
Right, and you kind of see some of this desperation with all the opinion pieces in the New York Times, right? You have like this demand for we should have forced labor, we should have, as you say, the conscription, 1 year of mandatory duty. Like, I mean,
Nobody's going to go along with that, and especially with the
nobody's going to go along with
with the
it.
inoculation requirements in the military, especially. I mean, I know that the majority of the American population, got the first two, and we're a bit skeptical of the third and fourth, and some of us, I can neither confirm nor deny with myself, didn't get any at all, and once again, like you want to force that, and then you want to try to demote the I think it was like the Oklahoma and the Texas National Guards for not trying to implement the mandates. I think the federal government tried to do that. It's a system of complete dysfunction. I don't know. Maybe people said this in the 1940s. Maybe people said this in the 1970s that there's no way out. But and maybe it's just this because this is Zoomer's first crisis and everything. But I don't see any way out.
Yeah, Indian Bronson on Twitter had a great little tweet about this and included he subtweeted the End Times, who had the screen caps of the New York Times asking for the draft and for mandatory service and so on. I have seen them through, especially this year. He writes, the regime knows there's nothing left for the national ethos, all erased because anything celebrating the heritage American nation, the nation without whom there would be no America, mostly white people, was, quote, white nationalism, end quote. But the US elites still want labor and troops. And now
Well, I think
it's
there's
funny
another
because
big question
Indian
for the
Bronson,
for
of
the
course, is not
military.
white. He is actually Indian, like from continental India,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Subcontinental India. So I thought that was an interesting thing.
Well, I think there's another
That I
elephant
saw.
in the room when it comes to the whole military thing is the physical state of most Americans, whether it's obesity or
Yeah,
other
yeah.
health problems. Now, I know like obesity, through physical conditioning can be very easily fixed, but that's not getting into the other health problems and the health problems that certainly aren't caused by the inoculation as well. It's it's a pardon my language, it's a clusterfuck. There's no way out of this.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we've mentioned that on the show weeks ago. Conscription, not conscription, but volunteer for American military forces is down 23% across the board.
Yeah, and that's
And
even with foreign recruits, with these people in like Colombia and and wherever else who serve for citizenship. Like even bolstering our numbers with what are effectively foreign mercenaries and real mercenaries at sometimes.
mhm.
There's a manpower crisis. Technology can only make up for that so much. And you look at the polls that come out of countries like, are you willing to fight for your country if we go to war? Western Europe is always like in the 20s and 30s. United States is in the 20s and 30s. Russia was in the 50s, which I mean, that's not great, but it's a marked improvement. China was, I think, somewhere in like the 60s, as much accurate data as you can get out of China. But it was particularly studied about the United States and Europe, and Russia. But point being is, uh, I can only repeat myself for what is it, the third or fourth time here. It's game over for the American Empire within the decade. I know
Really?
that's a bold prediction, but I'm going to come out and say it. It's game over for the American Empire within the decade.
Uh, wow. Hmm. I mean, I don't know. I can't. I'm more pessimistic than you are.
Uh, yeah, yeah. You bring that up, but okay, maybe I'll revise it slightly. Within a decade, by 2032, the American Empire is done.
Oh wow. Okay.
Okay.
It's bold, but I know no other way to put it.
I might pour a glass of scotch.
Yes, with your Crimean beach house,
Yeah.
as you get for your reward for your service to Vladov Putler, which hopefully I will get something. Hopefully I'll get something a bit warmer, but I'm not going to complain if I get anything. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is a momentous year. We'll just have to see what happens. I think what happens in Taiwan is going to be over Taiwan is going to be huge because I think the escalation is it's going to happen with the Chinese making certain sanctions. And now, of course, I'm sorry, China owns a huge amount of American debt, which ties it in with America. They would have to be careful about how they do that. They have been making efforts to lessen the amount of debt that they have. And this is why Japan now is the largest holder of American debt.
Real return to the '90s. You gotta love it.
Yeah.
This is your return to the '90s. And because that's been the whole nostalgia push, even with everything. But here you have it. Japan owns our debt. That we have our vassal state own our debt. Like that's it's not a serious empire. Not by any means.
Right. But as you mentioned, like everybody thought Russia would default, and like actually, it's like there's been almost a swap. The 600 billion that they took from Russia, and then there was discrepancies that it wasn't that high. And anyhow, that was based on like even stuff that Burrell said. So nobody's for sure how much was frozen in foreign assets. Or sorry, it was like half of 650, something like that. And then there's all this stuff because of course Russia created a system where like, yeah, we'll pay you, and it's the reverse of their payment scheme for commodities and oil and gas, because they're doing it now for grain as well, where you pay us in your dollars or whatever your currency is, and we convert that into rubles, which has strengthened their dollar and their commodities. And so what the way they propose to pay off this force, because it's a force majeure. I mean, they're not defaulting. The Americans just won't allow them to pay. It's like the Canadian or the American government uh, targeting you as a dissident, and they freeze your bank account, and you can't pay your debts. So the debts rack up, and there's interest on that. That's intentional, right? Um, well, I mean, it didn't work out that way for the Russians. They, of course, had a scheme where they would pay in rubles and then you convert. Well, of course, the Americans won't do that because that would just strengthen the ruble. However, um, a lot of these payments are directly tied into to people's retirement funds, and those retirement funds are in America, most of them, right? And they're going to start panicking, and they're going to start suing pretty soon. So
I will leave you with
it's going to
this,
be fun times.
and this may be GSP levels of pessimism and blackpilled. I
Mm.
suppose, but prepare for the worst. Whether you're an
Literally.
American, you're a Canadian, European, or even you live in any of these other parts of the world, the worst is yet to come. Things will get worse. Make your peace. Make sure you have adequate survival materials, whether that's food, whether that's some sort of shelter or land, whether that's other just basic necessities, because these things, even in the so-called prosperous first world, are going to be much harder to come by. And anyone who's been intelligent, I think, has been doing exceptionally intelligent. I won't insult the intelligence of people who maybe were little late to wake up, but people who are exceptionally intelligent or exceptionally insightful have been doing this for years, especially since the beginning of 2020. That's when I started to build my stockpiles. I've been trying to add to a little bit more. But point being is, I'm not saying throw your life away and go live in a bunker, but have a backup plan in case things go
It's
wrong.
actually
I'll
not
just say
bad.
that much.
Actually, throw your life away.
It,
Live in
it,
a bunker.
come join my bunker cult, okay? I guess that's the way we're doing
My
things.
bunker cult.
Um, he who controls the resources will be the kingmaker of the coming future. But but point being is, I'm not telling you to do anything, but my personal opinion, you don't have to take it. This is take it or leave it. Is live day by day, do what you need to do. But do have a plan to run to the bunker.
Yeah.
And I say that in a much
Yes.
more chipper tone than I think it warrants, but I honestly, like, I know I will reiterate once again before I take the show to 2.5 hours because we're already at 2:10. So
Oh God.
I'll try to wrap this up, in the next couple minutes here. Um, while we've speculated about an abstract downfall of the American Empire, once again, at this point, it's a bold prediction. I give it a decade, and I
Mm-hmm.
again see no way out of this, and I could harp on about this for another 2.5 hours, but I think that would sort of numb you to the point. So I will bring it to a close. If you have any final comments, now would be the time.
Only that I love your optimism.
Yes, yes. It's all about perspective. Perhaps I'm being a bit too optimistic that the evil empire will fall.
Unironically.
But yeah, get ready because you haven't seen the worst of it yet.
Yeah. I like that title.
I had another title in mind, but we will discuss that off air.
Okay.
So thank you for tuning into this episode of the War Report, and we'll see you all hopefully next week. I know I left you on a pretty pessimistic and doom and gloom note, but don't worry, I'll try to be back next week. I can't make any guarantees though. And goodbye.
Goodbye. Take care.